Okay, so we again are grateful for technology that we can meet in and not necessarily face to face, but that cannot stop our desire to continue sharing knowledge. So I will set off with the advanced ecology, our second lecture. And in this, we want to see how we can classify vegetation that is occurring in the field, ways in which it can be classified, and ways in which assessments can be made. Okay. So vegetation just refers to the plant life that is present in a particular area. Okay, so the different types of plants you find in any particular area, that is the vegetation of that place or environment. And classifying that vegetation is important for us to be able to understand that ecosystem, possibly for reasons of biodiversity conservation, land management, and even issues of climate, because the conditions of a particular environment are what will lead to influence the type of vegetation that is present. So vegetation can be classified on the basis of the climate, the altitude, that's the height above sea level, the soil types, and the human activities. But maybe an important reason is, why are we bothering about vegetation? Why think of studying vegetation? So vegetation is important because it aids in conserving and management of ecosystems. Okay. Then the same vegetation helps in supporting agriculture and the land use planning. By looking at vegetation, you have an understanding of how the current change in climate is impacting an ecosystem. So when you are studying the vegetation of a particular environment, then you'll be able to understand if the climate change effect is impacting that ecosystem. Then generally, just by understanding the vegetation that is present in a particular area, it assists in ecological research and mapping of the biodiversity within that particular area. So the major vegetation types, if we think of using Kenya as an example, then we talk of very diverse types of vegetation, but they vary due to the differences in climate of that particular area, the altitude, how high above sea level is the area that the type of vegetation is found, and the type of soil that is present in that particular ecosystem. So the major types of vegetation then, using Kenya as an example, we have one type which you can now call forests. So forests happen to be those dense areas which are characterized by trees that are tall. They will have shrubs and even other plant species. So the forests are important because of water conservation, biodiversity, and climate regulation. Okay, so the one major type of vegetation is forest. When you think of examples in our country, Kenya, then you think of the montane forests, which these ones are found in high altitude areas. So you think of the forests found in areas like the Aberdare Ranges, Mount Kenya, the Mau. So by virtue of their location in high altitude areas, then these montane forests mostly receive high rainfall. And the type of trees that you find in these montane forests are of the camphor, the cedar, and the olive. Okay. Still examples of the forests, you now find the tropical forests. These are found in areas that are fairly wet and humid. So you talk of, for example, Kakamega forest. And these ones, because of the climate, then you find a higher diversity of plant species, okay, within now the tropical forests, rainforests. We have the coastal forests, which are located along the coastal region. Okay, so an example is the Arabuko-Sokoke forest, which is found along the Kenyan coast. And these coastal forests will contain unique tree species and even animal species which are adapted to the environmental conditions that are found along the coastal regions. The second type of vegetation is savanna, which is just the grassland or even the woodlands. So savanna is a mix of grasslands and some scattered trees, okay? And the grassland with the trees that are scattered across these grasslands end up now supporting not only wildlife, but also by virtue of the presence of grass, then most of the savanna is also used for livestock grazing. Okay, so we have the examples are given there. But the other type of vegetation now is this arid and semi-arid vegetation. So the arid and semi-arid vegetation, these are found in areas that have low rainfall. They receive fairly low rainfall. And therefore the vegetation that we find in these areas that are receiving low rainfall should be having the adaptations to those conditions of low rainfall, so the drought-like conditions. The examples we give for this, for example, are the shrublands, which you find in areas like Turkana, Marsabit, and Mandera. So most of these areas will have those small tough shrubs like the acacia, like the euphorbia species. You also have the desert vegetation, what you find, for example, in the Chalbi Desert in Marsabit. Okay. So within the desert vegetation, the vegetation is very sparse. Okay. But the plants that you find there are drought resistant. You are talking of things like the cactus. Okay. So they have, that's now where we're talking of climate playing a role in determining how the vegetation types are distributed across landscapes. The other type of vegetation is the wetlands and the riverine vegetation. So the wetlands and riverine vegetation occur along rivers, lakes, and swamps. So one thing you notice, because they are occurring just on the edge of the rivers, the edge of the lakes, the edge of the swamps. So which means there is water availability, which is now supporting that plant growth. So when you talk of the wetland and the riverine vegetation, then you find it, for example, what is within the Lake Victoria Basin. Okay, what you find in the Tana River Delta, so the mangroves. Okay, so all that is important with the wetlands is that there is presence of water. Okay, so there will be also other types of wildlife that will be present within this type of vegetation. Okay. So Having looked at the types of vegetation that you can find in the field, how then can we assess, using which methods can we assess the presence of vegetation in the field? So assessment of vegetation involves collecting information about the plant types, the density, and the conditions in the particular areas where the plants that you are looking at, the vegetation that you are looking at, is found. So to do this assessment, to study this vegetation, there are different methods that can be employed. One of it is the quadrant sampling. Quadrant sampling employs a quadrat. A quadrat is a square frame which is used to sample a specific area. Then now within that square frame, you count the number of plants that are in there. You analyze the vegetation density within that quadrat. Okay. So how this quadrat sampling works is that you have a square of known dimensions, maybe 1 meter by 1 meter or 2 meters by 2 meters, which you place randomly in the field. Then now you count and record the plants that you find within that quadrat. So you repeat that process severally across the whole area where you want to study the vegetation, where you want to do your vegetation assessment. So assume, for example, you want to do a vegetation assessment across the fields in Alupe University. So you get your quadrat out in the field and randomly place the quadrat. Then you count within that quadrat the known dimensions, maybe 2 meters by 2 meters. So as you place it randomly, you get a count of how many plants are present and which types of plants are present within that. Then that will give you an idea of the density, because density is about numbers per area. Okay. So the quadrat sampling, you place this square randomly in a specific area, and then you do the count, you count the plants, you analyze the vegetation density. Then now it can give you an idea of how you can project that to the whole area that you are studying. Another method is the transect method. A transect is a line that is drawn across an area, so that then one can study the vegetation, how the vegetation change happens along the environmental gradient. For example, maybe you want to understand, you want to study the changes of vegetation from a river as you approach the dry land. Then now you'll come with a line and draw from the river all the way to the dry land. Then now you'll walk along that line, then you keep recording, you analyze the vegetation types as you observe them change at particular intervals. Okay? So how the transect method works is you have either a rope or a measuring tape that you lay across a landscape. Then now you move around, you move along that rope, along that tape, and you record, you make observations and record at intervals. If, for example, you've put 50-meter rope, then you can decide that you'll be recording after every 10 meters. Okay, what you see after every 10 meters. So as you move along, then you'll be able to appreciate what are the changes in terms of the types of vegetation. As you are you are moving from one section of the transect to the other. So what are the changes and what are the numbers, okay, of those particular intervals? So if you lay such a transect, then it can help you to appreciate how vegetation is changing with a particular factor. For example, with altitude. So you could lay a transect from a low altitude to a high altitude. So you move along as the altitude changes. You could also lay a transect to help you understand how the amount of rainfall, as the amount of rainfall changes, how does that impact on the vegetation type and on the vegetation density. You could also try to understand how the variation in the soil type. So you lay your transect from one soil type to another. So as the soil type changes, you move along to understand how the type of vegetation is changing along that transect, and also how the numbers, how the density is also changing as you move along that transect. A more advanced way, you realize the two, those are things you can do with very minimal technological investment. But now something that is more advanced, which uses more modern technology, is remote sensing and the GIS. Okay, so the Geographical Information System, that's the GIS. So with this, then you are using satellite images to assess large areas of vegetation. Okay. So we have satellites all over, which keeps capturing the images as time goes by. So you can now tap into these satellite images, then we use them to analyze. You use those images to analyze the types of vegetation, how the vegetation density, how the cover changes from one place to another, how the land use changes, how the health of the plants that we can see, how the health of the vegetation that we can see across an ecosystem, how that is. So the remote sensing and GIS is best for large-scale monitoring, for example, of deforestation. So you think of a big forest like Kakamega Forest, where you cannot have a transect, where you cannot have, for example, your square that you use because it's too big, too large, it's massive. So with that one, you can use the satellite captured images. So you can understand if you are having images that are captured by satellites of that entire forest, it gives you an idea where deforestation is happening, because you can see an area where people are encroaching into the forest. Then you can move in and put in a remedy. Okay? You can also have an idea of the climate changes, how that is affecting the vegetation cover. Because as climate changes, we are having a hotter world. The world has gone up in terms of global temperatures by around 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that means some plants, for example, which needed a colder environment could be affected by that change. So you can use the satellite images to have an idea within the last 1 year, how has this forest changed? Okay. Is it increasing? Is it shrinking? And is it because of human encroachment, or is just the changes within the climate? The land cover changes. How are certain areas that were initially just covered, for example, by grass, are they still covered by grass, or the grass is drying up? So it gives you an idea based on the satellite images on what is happening in ecosystems, but on a large scale. Another thing you can do is the canopy cover assessment. So this method will be measuring the percentage of ground that is covered by tree leaves and branches. That's the canopy. So how much of the ground is covered either by tree leaves or branches? So which means now with the canopy cover, you look upwards through a grid to estimate the canopy cover. So if you record a high canopy cover, that will just mean that the forest at that particular section is dense. At times you move through forests and you can hardly see even the sky. You cannot see through the forest. So in that section, there will be a very high canopy cover. But you get to some other sections and you hardly struggle to see the sky, because when you look up, all you see is you have spaces in between the trees. So sections where the exposure to the sky is high just means there is low canopy cover. Low canopy cover indicates sparse vegetation. Okay. So the canopy cover assessment is best when you are assessing the health of a forest and biodiversity. So when you have a high canopy cover, that means the forest is rich, the forest is dense in that area. But when you have a low canopy cover within a forest, then it means the vegetation within that particular place is very sparse. Okay. At times, you also might need to identify the species that are present within a particular ecosystem, the vegetation species, and classify, because that gives you an idea of which plants are growing here. It gives you an idea of the climate supporting them. Okay. So if you find plants that require an arid environment growing in an area, then it tells you that area is possibly arid. Okay. So you identify the plants, and how to do that, you use field guides. Okay. So there are books that have been published which will give you guides on how to identify certain plant types. That identification, that classification is based on their families, their genus, and the species. So the species identification and classification is best suited for studying the biodiversity in forests and other protected areas. A good forest should have a high biodiversity, which means it should have many different types of trees. Okay? But some protected areas, maybe you are protecting a particular tree, maybe an Elgon teak that takes so long to grow. So you'll want to identify that we've been protecting this particular type of tree here. Are the numbers increasing? Or do we still have it, or it is no longer there? Okay. So that is how you can do the classification of the vegetation. But this vegetation hardly grows in areas where we don't have human beings. So it means we end up now having an impact of the presence of human beings in areas where the vegetation is present. So what are some of the impacts that humans have on vegetation cover? One of it, of course, is deforestation. Deforestation is when you are clearing forests, either so that you can have somewhere to farm or somewhere to build your house. For example, what has happened in the Mau. Okay. In areas where you have vegetation, but you have people keeping livestock. Okay. So in such areas, there is a risk of overgrazing, because when livestock graze in an area for too much, there is a risk that they will reduce the vegetation cover. Another impact that humans have on vegetation is urbanization. Okay. With the expansion of towns, of cities, we end up reducing the natural vegetation. Another thing that came with the technology is agriculture. Agriculture leads to the conversion of huge tracts of vegetation into farms where you only plant a common type of maybe species of plant, like coffee, like tea, like maize. So what you'll have done, you'll have cleared different types of vegetation. You've removed grass, you've removed trees, you've removed shrubs, only for you to plant one species. So umetoa hiyo yote ukapanda mahindi. The impact is you will have reduced diversity, the biodiversity of that particular area. Okay. Then now the last impact that humans are creating, which is eventually affecting ecosystems, is climate change. So we said there is a rise, generally there is a rise in global temperatures. This rise is created by human activity. Okay, so the impacts of climate change is the rising global temperatures, the unpredictable rainfall patterns. All these rising temperatures, the unpredictability, the rainfall patterns, they end up affecting the vegetation cover. But now, because we realized how important vegetation is, are there things that can be done so that we can conserve and manage this vegetation? So we've got several efforts that have been put in place. But if we continue doing reforestation and afforestation, so we plant trees to restore forests. Okay, that is a way in which we can conserve, in which we can manage. When we create national parks and reserves, because these are protected areas. So an area that is protected, it means access is restricted. So within that area, then we can conserve not only wildlife, but also vegetation. You can come up also with the community-based conservation. So you have areas now where you have the local communities being involved in most of the conservation efforts. You can also encourage the sustainable agriculture, where you encourage agroforestry and some aspects of controlled grazing so that you can protect that land. Lastly, the enforcement and development of environmental laws and policies. So if there are laws, the environmental laws and policies that have been developed, let them be enforced. But if there are gaps within those laws, then let the necessary governmental organizations come up with those regulations so that at least deforestation and land use can be regulated so that we conserve our vegetation. Okay. So in conclusion, vegetation classification and assessment are crucial in the conservation of our environment. We have diverse vegetation types, which is a basis, which is a creation of either the environment, the soil type, the altitude, okay, and ways in which we can study and analyze this vegetation exist. Several of them exist, where you can use the quadrat sampling, you can do the transect surveys, you can do the remote sensing, among others. Okay. But even as we try to study, as we try to analyze and classify the vegetation, the reality is that human activities are threatening our natural vegetation, and therefore we need to make deliberate efforts so that we can conserve this vegetation for the sake of sustainability. Okay. So we'll move on and look at something else. We've seen the different types of vegetation, but let's see a bit about the flora that is found on the different land masses. Okay. So the factors that are influencing the distribution of flora across ecosystems, across different land masses, is climate. What is the temperature? What is the rainfall? What is the humidity of a particular environment? Because that will affect the plant growth. The type of soil that is present in that environment, because some plants will grow just in a given type of soil. There are some which will need fertile volcanic soils, while others will do better even in a sandy soil or clay soil. The altitude, how elevated is a particular area. Okay? So as the elevation increases, temperature and oxygen levels decrease. So it means as you go in areas with a very high altitude, then you tend to find plants that are able to withstand low temperatures and low oxygen levels. Okay. So that will be affecting the type of plant that you find in a particular altitude. Then the water availability. So the wetlands will support aquatic plants, while deserts will support drought-resistant plants. Then another factor that determines the distribution of flora in different land masses are human activities. When there are high deforestation, where people practice high agriculture, in areas where the level of urbanization is high, you realize that there will be varied plant distribution, especially the natural plants in that case. So the flora of different land masses in Kenya, when we have examples from Kenya, then we are talking the mountain flora. So the plants you find in mountains. Okay. So mountains will have varying plant species on the basis of their altitude. So at lower elevations, hapa chini ya mlima, utapata forests dominating. But as you go up, as the high altitude increases, you now have to find plants that are resistant to cold, which means as you go up the mountain, then the types of plants, the types of flora changes, okay? Because the conditions are also changing. So the key adaptations for the mountain flora is high altitude plants. As you go up the mountain, you find plants with thick leaves so that you can reduce water loss. Okay. Then you find some plants growing in clusters so that they can conserve heat. Within the forest, you have dense areas with tall trees, you have shrubs, you have undergrowth. And these forests will be providing habitats for diverse wildlife, and they help in climate regulation. The forests will be different. You have the tropical one, the montane forest, the coastal forests. The adaptation of the forest flora is that you have most with large, broad leaves so that they can capture more sunlight, depending on where the forest is found. Then you find that if the trees are tall, they will have roots that should be able to ensure that these tall trees are still stable, which means the roots will have also gone fairly deep to stabilize them. Otherwise, they fall off. Okay. When you find areas that the forest is so dense, then you are likely to find that there are plants that are growing on the trees, what we call the epiphytes. So they grow on trees so that they can access sunlight, because if they grow under the trees, at that point, the canopy is so thick. So they need to find somewhere on top of a tree to increase their chances of accessing sunlight. Okay. Within the savanna, within the grassland flora, those are areas where you have mixed landscapes. So you have grass, you have scattered trees, you have shrubs. So they are found all over. But what is critical for the flora within the savanna and grasslands, the key adaptations is that most of them will have deep roots to help them access the underground water. Some, like the acacia, will have thick barks, so that those thick barks will not only help in resisting fires, but also in the resistance against drought. Okay. Then some of them will be having very small leaves to help in the reduction of the loss of water, which is generally not as abundant in this type of ecosystem. But now the wetland and the riverine flora, these ones are the ones that are found just next to the riverbanks. Okay? So they will be supporting plants that are adapted to waterlogged soils. Because within a wetland, within a riverine area, within a riverbank, there is so much water. Okay? So within that, then you find soils that have water that are saturated with the water, so to speak. So it means the plants that are supported, the flora you find in this ecosystem must be adapted to soils that are saturated with water. Okay. And such plants will help in filtering the water. Then these plants as well will help with stopping water, the soil erosion in that particular ecosystem. So you think of, for example, the mangroves at the coast. Okay. They are adapted to growing in the waterlogged soils. There are fish that will reproduce and multiply within the roots of the mangroves. The same mangroves also help in stopping soil erosion. But the adaptation, they will be having the ability to have roots that can not just be within the water, but the roots will be helping in the breathing outside. Okay. So the different flora on the different land masses will be having adaptations that enable them to thrive, to survive within that land mass. The key adaptations now of the plants you find in the wetlands and the riverine, the wetland and riverine flora, we will find that some of the plants will be having floating leaves. If the leaves are not able to float, then if the leaves are held within the water, okay, then there will be problems for the access, for example, to sunlight. So for example, the water lilies, their leaves have to float so that they have an increase in the access to sunlight. The mangroves will have the aerial roots which help them to access oxygen, because remember, the soils where the mangroves are growing are waterlogged, meaning there is possibly no air in the soil. So it must have an adaptation to enable it access oxygen through other means. So the roots will be aerial in the mangroves case, for example. So what is happening here? The plants are coming up with ways to enable them to thrive in their current landmass. If it is found in a waterlogged, in a wetland, in a riverine landmass, the plant has to come up with adaptations for it to grow in that particular environment. Okay. The semi-arid and desert flora. So semi-arid and deserts, these are regions that have low rainfall and extreme temperatures. So it means the flora you find there must be adapted to survive in areas with low rainfall and extreme temperatures. So it means then the key adaptations of those plants is that you find most of them being succulents. Okay? So they have thick leaves, thick stems, which help in storing water. Think of the cactus, for example. Others will be having very small leaves, but which are waxy. Okay? So they are shiny. The leaf being small means a reduction in the surface area. Okay, being waxy means it helps in the reduction in the amount of water that can be lost. Okay. Then some of these plants, because the areas that they are found, the semi-arid and desert flora, have very low rainfall. Then some of these plants will be having very deep roots in an attempt for those roots to tap into the underground water. Okay. So, irrespective of where the landmass is, you still are likely to find humans present, which means there will still be an impact of humans on the various types of flora found in the different landmasses. Okay? So the same things, you'll still have various human activities which are threatening flora in the different landmasses. So we'll still have deforestation, we'll still have overgrazing, we'll still have things like pollution, where chemicals are being released from industries, released from farms where people are using chemicals to control weeds. So these chemicals will be impacting the natural vegetation, urbanization, climate change, among others. Okay. So we've gone through what the classification is. We've looked at how you can assess. We've come all the way to see the types of flora that we find on different landmasses. We've seen how the human activities can threaten the presence of this flora. The conservation efforts and the management of this flora are key because we rely on the flora. We as animals, we rely on plants. So we need these plants to be conserved, the plant resources to be conserved and managed sustainably so that we can continually derive benefit from them. So the ways to conserve and manage are the same as the ones that we had talked about. So you can think of reforestation and afforestation. Okay? Think of creation of protected areas. You can think of bringing in community-based conservation efforts, where now you engage local communities in tree planting. Okay? You engage them to ensure that they don't cut trees just anyhow. Then in the cases now where you have to come up with laws, then the government of the day, the necessary government agencies can come up with regulations to ensure that deforestation and land use are dealt with in a sustainable manner. Come up also with what we call sustainable agriculture. So promote organic agriculture. Organic agriculture, you don't use fertilizers, no chemicals. So which means you are reducing pollution. You come up with ways on which you can control grazing. Controlling grazing means beginning with determining how many animals you can keep on a particular area. Because the more animals you keep, the higher the risk of overgrazing. So you will need just to keep enough to prevent overgrazing. We saw overgrazing is one of the effects. So when you come up with sustainable agriculture practices, then you reduce pollution and also you reduce overgrazing. Okay? So in summary, the flora of different land masses will vary on the basis of climate of that particular landmass, the altitude of that particular landmass, and the type of soil that that particular landmass has. The different diverse plant lives that we have in Kenya will range from mountain forests, the savanna grasslands, and the desert shrubs. Then we have the wetlands and the riverine flora. All in all, we have human activities that are threatening the occurrence of the natural vegetation. And because of the importance of this natural vegetation, it is key that we come up with conservation efforts so that we ensure that environmental sustainability, which is very crucial, not only for our survival as animals, we human beings who are animals, but also just for the entire ecosystem. Okay? So we'll proceed from here next time, but I will share these notes so you go through, and where you have a challenge, you reach out. But I'm sure they are fairly, clearly explained. So thank you very much, and we'll keep in touch. Asanteni.